In the market town of Wexford Parva, the morning routines were so consistent that even the pigeons had grown impatient with them. At precisely 9:20 every Tuesday, the brass clock above Hensley's ironmonger's struck a sound no one truly heard any more. It was not ignored so much as accepted, like the warm dust that drifted across the cobblestones or the faint green stain at the base of the war memorial. It was part of the shape of things. That particular Tuesday began with the same usual accuracies. Mrs. Fallow, whose entire reputation was built upon the punctual arrangement of bread rolls, placed 6 seed buns and 4 plain into the wicker tray of the stationer's widow without a single miscount. Mr. Tilden, the retired auctioneer, took precisely 3 minutes to study the post office notice board despite having no intention of attending any of the events. And Miss Agrippa Holt, assistant librarian and local champion of unreciprocated romance, dusted the lower shelf of the village history section with such dedication that one could have believed it a sacred altar. Nothing suggested that it would be remarkable until the bell rang. Not the clock bell, the small handbell at the door of Proust and Sons tea rooms, which ought to have produced a dainty, apologetic sound. What it produced instead was a prolonged metallic shriek. It scraped the nerves in a manner unsuitable for an establishment that prided itself upon whispering. The sound, when it had finished alarming the china, revealed something more disturbing than a broken spring. The garden competition board, the large framed notice that listed winners of Wexford Parva's annual Civic Bloom Awards, was missing. It had hung in its accustomed position for 17 years. It had never been moved without subcommittee approval, laminated minutes, and at least 2 expressions of clerical doubt. Now it was gone. Miss Pomfrey, proprietress of the tea rooms and possessor of a temperament built entirely upon weak tea and strong disappointment, stared at the exposed wall. "There is," she said quietly, to no one in particular, "a space where something respectable used to be." Within 10 minutes the town possessed an emotion. Not alarm, not fear, offence. The absence was more insult than loss. The board held no money, no jewels, no secrets, only names of ordinary citizens whose begonias had once dared to sit above average. It was a shrine to mediocrity carefully improved upon. By 10:30, the word "a stolen" had begun to be used carefully, like a porcelain cup passed between fingers. By 11, 2/3 of the town had independently reached the conclusion that it must be connected to the Ferry Lane allotment dispute, though none of them could recall who had been involved in that. And by noon, the police were informed, though without urgency. Inspector Purbright arrived at 12:45, which was neither particularly swift nor offensively slow. He examined the vacant patch of wall for nearly a minute without speaking. His expression suggested mild interest in the plasterwork. "Has anyone," he asked mildly, "considered that it might not have been stolen?" Miss Pomfrey stiffened. "We pride ourselves on stability," she replied. "Nothing here moves without cause." Behind her words, however, hung a small truth. Something in Wexford Parva had long been waiting to move, and someone had already been preparing for it. By early afternoon, the absence on the wall had stopped being a matter of furniture and had become a matter of feelings. People drifted into Proust and Sons not because they wished for tea, which in Wexford Parva was never a genuine desire, but because it gave them an opportunity to stand near the empty space and demonstrate that they understood the seriousness of it. They did this by saying very little. Silence properly arranged was considered a form of loyalty. Even the teaspoons seemed to pause in their cups, as though metal itself were gathering opinions for the occasion. Inspector Purbright remained where he was, studying the faint rectangle of clean wallpaper that had been protected from years of steam and polite decay. His manner suggested not curiosity but courtesy, as if he did not wish to embarrass the wall by staring too rudely. Behind him the door opened and closed with apologetic tinkles, admitting townspeople who pretended to be surprised as though surprise might be contagious. Each of them carried a theory, folded neatly away behind the eyes, like a shopping list one hoped would not be requested. It was a discipline the town practiced than honesty daily. Miss Pomfrey moved among the tables with exaggerated softness, pouring tea that nobody intended to drink and laying down saucers that nobody intended to use. She watched Purbright with the guarded hope reserved for men who might repair things without making a fuss. When he asked her, with perfect politeness, how long the board had been absent, she stiffened slightly, not out of fear, but out of respect for the gravity of measurement. In Wexford Parva, time was a social construct, and precision was a sign of breeding. She answered in minutes, then corrected herself to something nearer the truth. Outside, the square adopted its usual posture of respectable concern. Mr. Tilden leaned against the postbox in a way he hoped suggested informed patience, while quietly enjoying the fact that he was at the centre of a problem. Two members of the parish council arrived together and stood far enough apart to imply independent thought. They spoke in low voices that rose and fell like polite waves, never quite daring to name a suspect, yet circling several desirable possibilities. Incidents in Wexford Parva were a form of entertainment, and nobody wished them resolved too quickly. Suspense was socially acceptable. Purbright stepped outside without hurry and greeted the small assembly as one greets a line of umbrellas, with calm acknowledgement and no expectation of shelter. He asked courteous questions which appeared on the surface to have no destination. Had anyone noticed strangers? Had the door been locked as usual? Had the weather seemed more damp than yesterday? These inquiries, while apparently soft, had the effect of unsettling those who preferred their thoughts to remain uncollected. It is a great disturbance to realize that even one's overlooked memories may be of official interest. Faces tightened with a dignity practiced over decades. Among those listening was a man who said nothing at all. Leonard Pike, clerk of minor accounts and guardian of very small sums, had come early and remained late, a habit which passed for virtue. He kept his hat on his knees and did not look at the place where the board had been. In a town where gossip was a kind of currency, his silence felt oddly expensive. Several noticed it. None remarked upon it. To remark would be to admit curiosity, which was considered faintly ill-bred. Even Purbright seemed to accept it as part of the weather. As the afternoon wore on, courtesy grew heavier. Each person became careful not to accuse, not to suggest, not to imagine too far ahead of their manners. This produced a confusion that was exquisitely managed. Everyone was lost, but with extraordinary politeness. The teacups collected in ranks, the chairs were nudged back into precise obedience, and the empty space on the wall became, by silent agreement, a participant in the room. It was treated with consideration, given a little distance, as one does with an elderly relative who forgets names. Respect was when directed toward that could not answer back. Purbright returned to the doorway and looked once more at the bare wall, not as a site of loss, but as a site of behaviour. It was not the disappearance that interested him, but the manner in which people adjusted their feet when they stood near it, the way their eyes avoided each other, and the small coughs that accompanied certain names. He thanked Miss Pomfrey for her patience, though she had offered none, and touched his hat with mild gratitude to the gathering outside, who felt in that moment slightly honoured. Confusion lingered, wrapped carefully in the town's manners. By the time the clock marked 4, nothing had been solved, which in Wexford Parva was considered a reassuring result. Problems were safest when they remained decorously complicated. Leonard Pike was still there, still silent, his fingers tightening slightly on the brim of his hat whenever the sound of the doorbell echoed from inside. Purbright noticed this only in the way one notices a change in light through a window, without comment and without haste. He merely waited, because waiting, he knew, was where the truth preferred to stretch itself. Courtesy had settled, but confusion had just begun to breathe. The light outside softened in a way that made the town appear more innocent than it had any right to be. Curtains shifted, kettles were filled without conviction, and conversations began that would not be finished honestly for years. The missing board remained absent, but its absence now had weight, a polite strain sitting in the air like an extra guest. Purbright walked a short distance down the street and stopped, not to inspect the shops, but to observe how carefully people avoided looking at one particular window, and how naturally they pretended not to notice that they had noticed. The window that people avoided belonged to no institution of consequence. It was not a bank, nor a chapel, nor even a shop that sold anything useful. It was simply the front room of Leonard Pike, who lived alone above what had once been a milliner's and was now a dust-reconciled vacancy. The glass was clean, too clean perhaps, wiped with the steady persistence of a man who believed that transparency was a form of alibi. The curtains, however, were never quite arranged, as though they had refused to take instruction from hands that trembled slightly too often. Inspector Purbright paused across the street with the air of a man admiring brickwork. He did not look directly at the window. Directness was for people in a hurry. Instead, he observed the reflections upon the glass, the war memorial's tired stone, a passing bicycle, the easy lie of late afternoon light. It was in these reflections that the town betrayed itself most freely, preferring to be noticed only when it thought it was not. The absence of the board had not loosened tongues, but it had tightened shoulders, and shoulders, unlike mouths, had difficulty pretending. Leonard Pike noticed the inspector without allowing his eyes to show it. This was a skill he had perfected since childhood, when noticing things too plainly had led to conversation, and conversation had led to examination. He sat behind a small table with a cup of tea he would not drink and a ledger he did not read. The ledger lay open to a page of figures so minor they gave an impression of harmlessness. The truth, which Leonard had curated over years of patience, was that harmlessness required a great deal of daily maintenance. Inside the tea rooms, Miss Pomfrey was explaining to a cluster of listeners that the bell had never made that particular sound before. She did so with the care of someone describing a medical history. Each repetition grew firmer, more factual, as though the story might one day be sworn under oath. Around her, heads inclined with thoughtful sympathy. The town was already beginning to agree upon memories it had not yet experienced. This was considered progress. What troubled Purbright was not what was said, but what was arranged not to be said. In Wexford Parva there were several kinds of silence. There was the respectable silence used during church, funerals, and awkward engagements. There was the companionable silence enjoyed on park benches by men who had learned how to listen to hedges growing. And then there was the wrong silence, the kind that arrived like a guest who removed his hat but kept his coat on. Leonard Pike's silence belonged to this final category. It sat too upright, breathed too carefully. A little after 5, the inspector crossed the street and rang Leonard's bell. It produced a small, truthful sound, as bells should. Leonard opened the door with a delay so slight it could not be accused of guilt, yet too precise to be innocent. He greeted Purbright with an expression of relief that had been practiced in advance, polished like a good pair of shoes. The inspector remarked upon the weather, because one must always begin with something that everyone is allowed to own. Leonard agreed, slightly too quickly, and stepped aside. The room was modest in the sincere way that suggested effort. A chair that had been repaired sat closer to the fire than comfort required, and a carpet had been turned so that its better side faced the door. Leonard offered tea, then forgot to make it. His hands hovered over the cups with an obedience that had lost its instructions. He spoke about nothing with careful fluency, the council, the drains, the unfortunate modern habit of walking quickly. Every sentence landed properly and went nowhere. Purbright listened with the patience of a man cataloguing birds he had no intention of trapping. He asked Leonard if he had been in the tea rooms that morning. Leonard said no with a speed that was almost musical, and then added that he very often went there, which was not the same thing, but sounded close enough to be respectable. It was at that moment that his voice fell by a fraction, a tiny slippage in the polished surface. The wrong silence entered the room very politely and took a seat. Outside, the square had begun its evening transformation. People closed their doors in slow stages, like eyelids. Curtains were drawn with that careful violence reserved for private thoughts. Mr. Tilden was telling a neighbour that he felt something was not quite in order, which was the town's way of investing in suspense. The absence on the wall grew colder as the daylight thinned, and the tea rooms took on the air of a place that had witnessed a minor scandal and was storing it for later. Leonard poured the tea eventually and spilt a little, which in a man of his habits was more damaging than a confession. He apologized twice and smiled once. Purbright thanked him as though nothing had been noticed. Yet, as he stood to leave, he observed something that Leonard himself could not see. The ledger was open not to figures, but to a blank page. It was not the blankness itself that mattered, but the care with which it had been turned to, like a destination prepared in advance. The wrong silence had a shape now, and it resembled intent. Purbright stepped back into the street as the first lamps were being lit. He did not hurry. He did not smile. He merely allowed the quiet to continue growing in the right places and shrinking in the wrong ones. Somewhere in the town a voice lowered when it should have risen, and a door closed more gently than necessary. The mystery had not yet spoken, but it had just taken a careful breath. Purbright allowed that breath to remain politely unchallenged. The lamps along the square steadied into their evening glow with the reliable patience of men who had seen everything and remained unimpressed. Light in Wexford Parva was never bright. It was merely sufficient, and even that felt like an indulgence. Inspector Purbright walked beneath it slowly, his footsteps neither loud enough to announce him nor quiet enough to be accidental. The town, which had been holding its breath all afternoon, released it very slightly and then immediately regretted the gesture. No one wished to be seen relaxing in the presence of a mystery. It suggested poor moral fibre. He returned to Proust and Sons not because he expected answers there, but because answers preferred the places where people pretended not to look for them. Miss Pomfrey was still there, engaged in the difficult art of looking useful while accomplishing very little. She had rearranged the chairs so that every one of them faced the bare wall in what could only have been described as a silent tribunal. The space where the board had hung appeared more self-conscious under lamplight, as though it had not agreed to be exposed in this manner. A small group of respectable citizens had gathered at one table, their expressions carefully balanced between concern and disinterest. Among them sat Mrs. Larkin, honorary secretary of the Floral Preservation Committee, who wore the kind of smile that had once won her a commendation for civility from a man who had no intention of returning stolen library books. She was speaking in the gentle tones of a woman accustomed to being admired for what she called her pleasant manner. It was in these tones that she delivered a compliment which landed, quite by accident, in the wrong place. "Well, Leonard always did have such a tidy mind," she said, lifting her cup with a faint tremor of approval. "So very careful. One always felt quite safe when he handled things." The words were meant to do nothing more than confirm her own generosity. Complimenting the absent was a hobby in Wexford Parva, particularly when one was confident they would never hear of it. But the name fell among the listeners in a manner unsuitable for light refreshment. Teaspoons paused. A chair made a small sound against the floor, which was the furniture's way of protesting. The compliment had not been requested, and in this town, unrequested praise was more dangerous than open accusation. Miss Pomfrey turned her head with the stiff delicacy of a lid being placed back upon a jar. "We don't often speak of Leonard," she said in the mild tone reserved for unseasonable weather. It was not a rebuke, it was a correction. There were rules about who could be admired and when. Leonard Pike, by virtue of being silent, had placed himself beyond ordinary appreciation. To compliment him was to suggest familiarity, and familiarity in small towns was a form of trespass. Purbright sat at a neighbouring table without any appearance of listening. He stirred a cup of tea that had long since surrendered its heat, and his eyes rested casually upon the reflection of Mrs. Larkin in a sugar bowl. The benefit of reflections was that they did not lie, though they often pretended not to understand the question. He noticed how her hand tightened slightly around the handle of her cup after she spoke, as though she wished she could gather the words back and place them somewhere safer. Conversation resumed, but with a newer, thinner quality. People began to compliment one another with awkward haste, as though praise could be made harmless through overuse. Mrs. Larkin remarked upon Miss Pomfrey's scones, which were notoriously tough. A gentleman from the parish council observed that the lighting was much improved, though nothing had been altered in over a decade. Each compliment fell with a small, dull sound, like a pebble dropped into a well that was shallower than expected. It was then that Leonard Pike entered. He did so with the kind of modest hesitation that suggested he had no desire to be noticed, and every expectation of being overlooked. His coat was buttoned too tightly, his hat was held with both hands, as though it might escape him and commit some social outrage in the process. The bell above the door made its ordinary sound, and yet everything in the room flinched, as though expecting it to scream again. Mrs. Larkin's eyes moved to him of their own accord. Habit was a powerful commander. "Oh, Mr. Pike," she said, before anyone could prevent her. "We were just saying what a careful fellow you always are." The compliment sat in the air between them, naked and indecent. Leonard's smile appeared with a delay that might have been mistaken for shyness if one were not paying attention. It moved his mouth but did not disturb the parts of his face that understood fear. He thanked her, because good manners were often the last defense of the exposed. But beneath his thanks something shifted, a recalibration too swift to be innocent. "You are very kind," he said, and then most unfortunately added, "One does one's best to keep things in order." Purbright felt the sentence settle somewhere behind his eyes. There were men who kept things in order because they liked order, and there were men who kept things in order because they knew what would happen if anyone looked too closely. Leonard's tone belonged to the second kind, though it wore the clothes of the first. Around the table, people found themselves suddenly interested in their cups. Compliments had been exchanged, and the exchange had gone badly. Mrs. Larkin busied herself with a biscuit she did not intend to eat. Miss Pomfrey started wiping a counter that was already clean. The board remained absent, but something else had appeared in its place. A faint shifting sense that Leonard Pike was not, perhaps, as untouched by the matter as politeness would desire. Purbright rose, thanked Miss Pomfrey for the tea with unnecessary earnestness, and stepped aside to allow Leonard's space to settle. He did not look at him directly. Direct looks were accusations. Instead, he remarked, lightly, upon how fine it was to see the town so appreciative of careful men. Leonard's hands tightened imperceptibly around his hat. Compliments, he had learned, were best endured rather than enjoyed. As Purbright left the tea rooms for the second time that evening, he felt the compliment still moving through the room like a slow, invisible draught. It had disturbed more than it had honoured. Small towns functioned on balance, and something had tipped. Leonard had been praised too loudly. Mrs. Larkin had observed too freely, and praise, when it fell in the wrong place, had a habit of loosening things that had been carefully nailed down. The following morning arrived with the sort of calm that suggested the town had decided, at least temporarily, not to collapse under the weight of its own conjecture. Doors opened a fraction later than usual, and kettles were filled with a deliberation that bordered on ceremony. Wexford Parva did not wake abruptly after disturbance. It edged back into itself carefully, as one might test a bruise before admitting it still existed. Yet beneath this surface calm, something new had entered circulation, something small enough to be missed and important enough to be judged. The item lay on the low shelf beneath the empty space in Proust and Sons. It had not been placed there with ceremony, nor had anyone seen a hand set it down. It simply appeared, as objects sometimes do when they do not wish to be explained. It was a small, narrow strip of brass, no longer than a man's little finger, with 2 tiny holes bored through it. It possessed no beauty and claimed no purpose. It was, in every respectable sense, unremarkable, and yet it commanded the attention of the room with the authority of a guest who had not been invited but refused to leave. Miss Pomfrey noticed it while pretending to tidy what did not require tidying. Her eyes descended and stopped, and for a moment she considered whether it would be more dignified to ignore it. In Wexford Parva, the discovery of an object was less troubling than the responsibility of reacting appropriately. She finally bent and lifted it with a teaspoon, as though direct contact might imply a relationship she was not ready to acknowledge. She placed it on the counter beside the till, where it rested in full view of everyone and belonged to no one. By mid-morning, the item had acquired an audience. People arrived to admire the space where the board had been and found instead this small metallic interruption. They stood close, but not too close, discussing it as though it were a weather occurrence rather than a physical thing. Hypotheses were formed carefully and abandoned with even greater care. It might have fallen from the frame, someone suggested, though no frame had ever contained such a shape. It might have been carried in on a shoe, though no shoe in Wexford Parva had ever enjoyed such adventures. The discussions were thorough and entirely unproductive, which was considered good form. Inspector Purbright observed it late in the morning, when the novelty had ripened into mild discomfort. He did not touch it. That would have been indecent. Instead, he leaned in slightly, allowing its dull surface to explain itself. What interested him was not the brass itself, but the fact that no one claimed it, not even by denial. In a small town, lost items were greeted like children with unknown parents. Everyone sought to place them somewhere else. This one remained politely orphaned. Leonard Pike arrived just before noon. He stood a little farther back than the others, leaning against a chair that did not require support. His eyes found the item and rested there, only for the briefest instant before moving away as though embarrassed by the intimacy. He said nothing, which in itself was unexceptional, but he adjusted his cuffs twice, which was not. Silence, when interrupted by unnecessary gestures, carried meaning like a folded note. Mrs. Larkin appeared soon after, carrying with her a basket of rolls that she distributed without enjoyment. She remarked upon the weather and then, too casually, upon the brass strip. "One hates to see things without a home," she said, with the careful sympathy usually reserved for minor widowers. Her gaze flickered across Leonard and retreated. She did not look directly at him. That would have been improper. But she did measure the distance between him and the counter with a glance so swift it nearly escaped her own conscience. The item remained untouched all afternoon. It lay there, quietly insisting upon its existence. People spoke around it, stepped around it, and in one notable case apologized to it for bumping the counter. It began to feel less like an object and more like a minor resident who had fallen on hard times. By late afternoon, its presence had worked its way into conversation throughout the square. Some had seen it. Others claimed they had known about it earlier. A few suggested they had always wondered what such a piece of metal might look like. Purbright watched the town respond to it with more interest than he had ever shown the missing board. He noted how quickly eyes moved away from it, how voices grew soft when near it, and how particular people arranged their bodies so that they could see it without being observed seeing it. The brass itself told him nothing. The people told him everything, though none of them realized it. There are objects in this world that reveal nothing, and yet create confession in others simply by refusing to explain themselves. Late in the day, Miss Pomfrey asked aloud whether anyone had lost it. The question was as careful as a china cup. It was intended to land lightly and do no harm. The reply was a silence so uniform it felt organized. No one spoke. No one moved. Leonard's hat dipped a fraction more firmly between his hands. Mrs. Larkin's lips parted, closed, and then arranged themselves into a smile not required by the situation. No one claimed it. No one denied it. The item remained what it had been since morning, acknowledged and yet alone. As evening crept back into the town, the lamps ushered shadows into corners that had previously been decorative. The brass strip caught a final gleam of light and looked almost alive, as though it had accomplished something without anyone noticing. Purbright, preparing to leave, inclined his head toward it in a way that could have been mistaken for courtesy. It was not gratitude, it was recognition. A town that failed to claim its misplaced things, he knew, was a town well practiced in hiding larger ones. And somewhere behind that unclaimed metal, something far more deliberate had chosen to stay silent. By the third day, Wexford Parva had reached that peculiar stage of disturbance where the facts no longer mattered as much as the impressions. The missing board had become less significant than the way people now spoke about it, and the small strip of brass had acquired a personality disproportionate to its size. In small towns, reputation was the true currency, and it circulated even more quickly in times of quiet unease. Coins could be hidden, names could not. The square wore its concern like a freshly pressed suit. Shopkeepers swept the same patch of pavement with greater attention, as though tidiness might be mistaken for innocence. Curtains were adjusted more frequently. Flowers were watered with a kind of moral urgency. Everyone felt the pressure of being seen to behave correctly, which in Wexford Parva was considered more important than actually doing so. The fear was not of crime, but of association. Leonard Pike began to feel this pressure as a physical sensation, a tightness just below the collar. He moved through the streets with the careful pace of a man balancing something fragile inside his chest. He greeted his neighbours with slightly more warmth than was his custom, and this alone drew attention. A change in habit was always interpreted as an announcement. People noted his smile, though no one described it kindly. They noted how often he paused at windows, how seldom he lingered at corners. For Cox, rumours once begun did not require evidence. They required only symmetry. Mrs. Larkin, for her part, found herself becoming an unwilling centre of speculation. Her compliment, which had been offered in innocence and received in discomfort, had begun its own small career. It had been repeated, softened, sharpened, and in one instance embroidered with additional words she could not recall ever speaking. Compliments were dangerous because they suggested preference, and preference suggested knowledge. Knowledge in turn suggested guilt by acquaintance. She began to feel watched by teacups and judged by teaspoons, which was in itself a sign of advancing social trouble. Miss Pomfrey experienced the problem of reputation in a more practical form. Her tea room, once a sanctuary of orderly dullness, had become a place of watchful pauses and deliberate glances. Patrons lowered their voices when she approached, not because they were discussing anything improper, but because lowering one's voice suggested propriety. The brass strip remained on the counter, now almost respectable through familiarity. It had not been claimed, but it had become a reference point, like an uncle no one quite trusted but invited for Christmas all the same. Purbright observed all of this as one might observe a clock that had begun to run fast without appearing to lose time. Reputation, he understood, was always the first casualty of doubt. It shifted like smoke, clinging to whichever surface appeared most convenient. He noted who crossed the street to avoid Leonard and who merely slowed. He noted who stopped looking at Mrs. Larkin and who began. It was rarely the openly suspicious who interested him, but rather those whose concern appeared carefully rehearsed, like lines from a play no one admitted to attending. The parish council met that afternoon under the pretense of discussing drainage. In truth, they were discussing dignity. The missing board, though never named directly, hovered over the long table like an inconvenience in polite company. One councillor suggested, without wording it so crudely, that the matter be resolved quietly, which was translation for before anyone important hears. Another spoke of the importance of maintaining the town's appearance, a concept treated with greater seriousness than structural integrity. Not a single name was mentioned, which in itself was a kind of accusation. Leonard felt the shift without anyone telling him so. When he collected his post, the clerk held the letters for a fraction of a second longer than courtesy required. When he stepped into the baker's, the loaf he was handed was slightly flatter than usual, as though even bread resisted him. These were not punishments, they were adjustments. Reputation in Wexford Parva was rarely destroyed. It was simply rebalanced until a person felt lighter, emptier, and less welcome in their own skin. Mrs. Larkin attempted to repair her position by increasing her kindnesses. She visited neighbours she had not seen properly in years. She sent small cakes that no one requested. She spoke even less of Leonard, which was immediately noticed as a sign of further involvement. Silence, once established, was as suspicious as speech. She began to recognize that reputation was not something one owned, but something that hovered just beyond reach like a hat always one size too small. As evening returned, the town settled into a version of itself that looked correct from a distance and strained up close. Lamps were lit. Doors were closed with deliberate soft clicks. The unclaimed brass strip remained where it was, now bearing the faint marks of having been almost moved by several hands that had changed their minds. Purbright stood in the dimming square and understood that the problem was no longer the missing board. It was the knowledge that everyone had begun to measure one another for fault, and that such measuring rarely ended cleanly. He walked slowly past Leonard's window, past Mrs. Larkin's gate, past the quiet dignity of Proust and Sons. He did not interrupt, did not question, did not accuse. He merely allowed the town to feel itself more clearly. Reputation had become the real disturbance, and it was far harder to restore than any wooden ball. Somewhere, a truth waited in the discomfort of being judged, and all around it, people were working very hard not to let their faces admit they were afraid. The fourth morning arrived with a thin, unsettled light that gave everything in Wexford Parva a slightly unreliable appearance, as though the town had been lifted and replaced at a faintly incorrect angle. This was the kind of morning that encouraged miscalculations. Doors were opened a little too hard. Footsteps landed where they were not intended. Even the pigeons in the square paused longer than usual before committing themselves to crumbs. The air carried no immediate drama, only a sense that something was about to misunderstand the rules. Inspector Purbright was standing near the war memorial when the sound reached him. It was not a loud sound. Loudness was vulgar. It was a dry, splintering crack, followed by the kind of silence that arrives too quickly to be natural. The source was soon apparent. The window of Proust and Sons had been broken, not shattered in fury, but fractured with peculiar precision. A small circular hole marred the glass, surrounded by faint, obedient cracks that seemed almost respectful in their restraint. It was an act that had required both intention and consideration. By the time Miss Pomfrey reached the front of her establishment, several citizens had already gathered, though none of them admitted to having heard anything. They examined the damage as one might examine a stranger's misfortune, with expressions carefully arranged to show sympathy without involvement. The brass strip remained upon the counter inside, untouched, though now it appeared to watch the broken pane with a calm that bordered on professional. Leonard Pike arrived later than usual, which in itself was cause for private note. He stood a little apart, his gaze moving not to the jagged hole, but to the expressions around it. He was not studying the damage, but the damage's effect. More than one person noticed his distance and found it just sufficient to be discussed and not sufficient to be defended. In Wexford Parva, the placement of a man's feet could be a statement if observed by enough people. The curious detail, and the one that most unsettled the atmosphere, was what lay on the floor behind the broken glass. It was not a stone as might have been tolerated. It was not a tool which might have been admired for its honesty. It was a small, wrapped parcel of paper, tied with a string that had once been white and was now undecided. It sat there as though it had been invited and had arrived early. Miss Pomfrey refused to touch it, which was taken as proof of her good upbringing. Someone suggested the police should see it, which was considered an unnecessarily dramatic thought given that the police were already standing outside. Purbright did not enter at once. He allowed the room to breathe, and the people to rearrange their faces into something they could later pretend was natural. When he did step in, the sound of his shoes upon the shattered glass was measured and apologetic, as though he were walking across a polished dance floor. He bent and examined the parcel without lifting it. The paper was torn from a ledger of the type used for accounts that no one admitted to keeping. The string had been tied twice, with the second not tighter than the first. It was not an impatient act. It was a careful one. The inspector straightened, thanked nobody in particular for their patience, and asked Miss Pomfrey very gently whether anything else appeared disturbed. She replied that nothing had ever been so respected. In her understanding, the breaking of a window did not suggest disorder if it was done tidily. Word travelled through the town quicker than usual that day, aided by the novelty of glass and string. Rumours were less cautious. They stretched further. The broken window was said by some to be a warning, by others a confession, by one reckless voice a joke in very poor taste. The parcel itself acquired a biography within hours. It was filled with money, secrets, threats, letters, and in one version, a small animal of questionable habits. Every version agreed on one point. It had been directed. Leonard felt the second disturbance settle into him, like a cold he could not admit to having caught. He found himself watched more openly now, not stared at, which would have been vulgar, but mirrored in glass and polished handles, measured by reflections rather than faces. His earlier silence now felt heavier, as though it had gathered weight from the broken window. He touched the brim of his hat too often. He walked a little faster than his nature allowed. These were the first signs of a man trying not to betray the fact that he was calculating. Mrs. Larkin, on the other hand, approached the scene with the calm despair of a woman whose sense of decency had been repeatedly mislaid. She looked at the parcel and felt her kindness tighten. It had always been her misfortune to admire people who later became inconvenient. She said nothing which was correct, but she thought too much, which showed faintly in the way she smoothed her gloves long after they were already smooth. Purbright did not open the parcel. He did not need to. The disturbance was not in what lay inside, but in what lay around it. The broken glass had given the town something it had not expected to have, a second problem. A first disturbance could be smoothed over, explained away, quietly forgotten. A second suggested pattern, and patterns were distressing. People began to look backwards, to adjust memories so that earlier moments might appear less innocent and more prophetic. By evening, the square had adopted a new stillness. It was no longer the quiet of routine, but the quiet of attention. Windows glowed with restrained light. Curtains were drawn with a care that implied rehearsal. The parcel remained where it had fallen, untouched, wrapped, and perfectly aware of itself. Purbright stood alone for a moment in the emptying tea room and allowed himself the smallest inward recognition that the game had changed. This was no longer a matter of absence. Something had arrived, broken, and placed itself firmly into the life of the town. Whatever had once been hidden behind politeness and habit had now made a second, more deliberate gesture. Somewhere between the hole in the glass and the knot in the string, a truth had begun to stretch, and it was not done making itself uncomfortable. Morning in Wexford Parva arrived with an uneasy generosity of light, revealing more than anyone had quite prepared to acknowledge. The broken window had been boarded neatly overnight, so neatly that the new would appear to apologize for existing. The parcel remained inside untouched, as though the town had accepted that it was now part of the furniture. The brass strips still sat upon the counter, and between the two of them they seemed to have created a small silent court of record. Nothing had yet been opened, but much had been remembered. People walked more slowly that day. They found excuses to pause, to look twice at things that had always been there. Corners held more weight. Door handles became more expressive in the hands that turned them. The mind of a town under strain does not seek new truths. It seeks old ones and attempts to rearrange them into shapes that feel safe. Memory in such places is not a record. It is a convenience. Miss Pomfrey, dusting a counter that accepted no further improvement, began recalling small details of Leonard Pike's habits that had once seemed unremarkable and now grew uncomfortable. She remembered how he had stood too long by the notice board in previous years, running a finger beneath names as though reading music. She recalled that he had once asked with soft voice and steady eyes how the board was fixed to the wall, though at the time she had assumed it was idle curiosity which was permissible in very small doses. These memories did not announce themselves. They crept in and settled. Mr. Tilden, leaning once more against the post-box, discovered that he now remembered a conversation from months before in which Leonard had remarked that wood, suitably persuaded, could be encouraged to move without disagreement. At the time it had seemed an observation of entirely academic value. Now it felt different. He also remembered that Leonard had once complimented Mrs. Larkin's carnations in a tone that suggested understanding rather than admiration. These recollections surfaced not because they were important, but because they were available. Leonard himself found that he was also remembering. He remembered the weight of the board, the one time he had helped rehang it when a bracket had failed. He remembered the sound of the screws biting into old plaster. He remembered the peculiar pleasure of seeing names in their final order, fixed and settled beyond argument. These thoughts came uninvited and left a faint taste of metal behind them. He told himself that remembering was natural. In Wexford Parva, it was not. It was dangerous. There was, too, the remembering of absences. People began to recall disagreements that had never quite been disagreements, merely quiet rearrangements of opinion. Someone remembered that Mrs. Larkin and the former winner of the Civic Bloom Award, now long moved away, had once stood too close together while speaking sharply. Another recalled a committee meeting where Leonard had been present when he had not strictly been required. These were small things, but they now found places to sit. Memory was furnishing empty rooms with uncomfortable chairs. Purbright listened to these recollections without appearing to solicit them. He had the skill of making people believe that their thoughts were their own inventions, when in truth they were merely releasing things that had been waiting to be heard by someone who would not react too visibly. He asked questions that seemed to wander toward gardening, rainwater, drafty corridors, and slowly the answers began to lean toward other rooms altogether. He noticed where voices tightened, where hands folded too carefully, and where memories arrived with the relief of confession and the relief of not being named as such. Mrs. Larkin, in a rare moment of private honesty, remembered that she had once defended Leonard sharply when someone had suggested he was dull. She recalled that she had done so with more heat than the remark required. She could not recall why. That, more than the defense itself, frightened her. Memory is not kind to those who rely upon decency as their only protection. She began to wonder when admiration had first changed into something that required silence. The parcel remained unopened, but people now remembered sounds. They remembered footsteps in the evenings they had not taken seriously. They remembered doors opening and closing when they had assumed it was the wind. They remembered seeing Leonard's light on later than usual, and his shadow moving strangely as though lifting something awkward. All of these memories had existed before. They had merely been stored away as harmless. Harmlessness, it seemed, was not as reliable as they had hoped. Purbright visited Leonard again that afternoon, and the visit itself forced new recollections to the surface. Leonard remembered the inspector's courtesy, and courtesy had always unsettled him. Kindness from strangers was harder to resist than suspicion. He spoke of ordinary things, and in doing so, remembered how much he had once wanted to be noticed and how carefully he had since trained himself to be invisible. These were not crimes. They were motives. Motives had their own gravity. By evening, the town felt heavier with knowledge it pretended not to possess. Memory had become a kind of weather, moving through streets and around corners, leaving damp patches in conversations. The broken window seemed less dramatic now than the fact that so much had gone unconsidered for so long. The missing board had become almost incidental. What mattered was that people were now remembering they had once chosen not to look. Purbright walked past the boarded window and stood briefly in the square. He understood that memory was the truest witness and the most unreliable. It softened things, sharpened others, and conveniently forgot what did not fit. Yet in the middle of this fog of recollection, certain facts remained stubborn. Leonard's silence, Mrs. Larkin's praise, the brass strip, the tied parcel, and the particular quality of politeness that had collected around them. He did not yet speak these connections aloud. That would have been rude. As the lamps were lit once more, memories continued to drift through open windows like slow, careful smoke. The town slept, but its recollections did not. They arranged themselves quietly, forming shapes that could not yet be named, but could no longer be ignored. And somewhere inside Leonard Pike, a memory remained that he refused to touch at all, resting untouched in the same careful silence that had protected him for years, waiting to be disturbed. The next afternoon found Wexford Parva suspended in a specially adjusted stillness, like a clock that had been carefully touched, but not yet allowed to move. The boarded window at Proust & Sons had been painted to match the rest of the frontage, which meant the damage now looked like a deliberate improvement. The parcel remained inside, still wrapped, still bothering no one in any obvious way. The brass strip, dulled slightly by fingerprints that had never quite committed to touching it, remained the small fixed centre of unease. The town had grown used to living around 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 unanswered 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 thing 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 to living around unanswered things 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 to living around around unanswered things, to living 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 around unanswered things, They had senses of survival. What I find curious, he went on, likely is that when the board was removed there were no torn screw holes, no splintering, no sound of effort really. It came away very neatly indeed. Leonard's fingers tightened around his hat without him being aware of it. It was a tiny movement, but it was timed badly. Purbright's tone remained kind. One wonders how that was managed. A strong hand, perhaps, or simply a patient one. Silence grew thicker. Even the parcel seemed to lean forward slightly. He stirred his tea and smiled faintly. Oh, but of course that hardly matters. He paused as though rearranging his thoughts. Or what matters far less, I should think, is something else entirely. He turned at last, not directly toward Leonard, but toward the empty space where the board had once been. "I wonder," he said quietly, "who last cleaned the back of it?" The question fell so softly that it seemed almost invisible, and yet it altered the air. It was a stupid question. A domestic question. A question for charwomen and idle afternoons. It had nothing to do with theft, with broken glass, with parcels. It was the kind of question that should have been dismissed instantly as irrelevant. Leonard did not dismiss it. No one else moved. No one else reacted. But Leonard's silence lengthened by just a fraction too much. It was no longer the silence of habit. It was the silence of calculation. His mind, which had held its gates shut for days, allowed one thought through. He had cleaned it. He had done so because he had needed to see something. He had needed to check the condition of the wood. He had needed to know how sound it was. He said nothing. He inhaled slightly faster. His shoulders adjusted, as though preparing for a weight he had never intended to lift in public. Mrs. Larkin felt the question strike somewhere near her ribs. She remembered with sudden clarity that Leonard had once offered very politely to help her dust the lower parts of the board after her flowers had been listed. She had thought him kind. She now thought him attentive. Purbright watched none of this in any obvious way. He had not accused. He had not named. He had asked a question that should not have mattered. That was the genius of it. Innocent questions were masks under which fear had no place to hide. He did not press. He did not elaborate. He allowed the silence to grow in its new, altered shape. After a moment he stood and thanked Miss Pomfrey for the tea. He remarked that the paint on the boarded window was drying beautifully. He adjusted his hat and moved toward the door. Behind him, Leonard remained sitting, hat clutched, breath shallow, thoughts suddenly loud. The question had not accused him of anything. It had merely stepped over a line he had carefully drawn inside his own mind. Once crossed, such lines could rarely be erased. As Purbright stepped back into the square, he felt, without smiling, that the first true movement had been made. The town, still pretending to be calm, had absorbed a sounds like a crack in old timber. The question that should not have mattered had been asked, and somewhere, in the neat mind of Leonard Pike, the answer had been given, though no one else could hear it yet. The day that followed was not dramatic, In Wexford Parva, drama would have been considered a breach of taste. It arrived instead with ordinary light and ordinary sounds, the sort of morning that pretended it had nothing to do with anything. The painted board over the broken window had dried to a dull, obedient finish. The parcel remained wrapped and undisturbed, a model of restraint. The brass strip, now faintly polished by the indecision of many cloths, remained in its place of minor honor. The air itself seemed to wait, not for revelation, but for permission. People came and went with careful expressions. They spoke of the weather because the weather could not be blamed. They spoke of tea because tea could not talk back. You waited some more, and when you moved it, you did so carefully because you did not wish to break the room that had broken your trust. The room felt suddenly as though it had been named. The parcel, he added softly, was not a threat. It is an apology. It is an apology. It contains the original screws you took out, wrapped and tied, because you did not wish to be a thief, only a corrector. Silence deepened, but it was no longer confused. It was clear. Leonard spoke at last, but only because words had become less dangerous than breath. I only meant his voice stopped. He had never been good at meaning things out loud. I know, Purbright replied quietly. That is why I have spoken as I have. Loudness would have been unkind. There was no handcuffing, no raised voices, no sudden movements. Truth, having been spoken softly, needed no theatre. Outside, the light went on doing what it always did, which was pretending not to notice. Inside, chairs were shifted, teacups touched and left untouched. Mrs. Larkin looked down at her gloves and found that they were not so clean as she had thought. Leonard stood slowly, not in shame, not in defence, simply in recognition that the room now knew a shape it had not dared to name. Purbright rose as well and adjusted his hat. There will be no scandal, he said mildly. A scandal would serve no one. No one argued. Scandal was considered vulgar. The truth remained in the room after he left it. It did not shout. It did not accuse. It merely sat gently beside the unclaimed brass strip and the still-wrapped parcel and waited to see what kind of town it had been placed in. The morning after truth had been spoken softly arrived with a reliability that bordered on kindness. The lamps were extinguished without comment, and the square resumed its habit of pretending that nothing essential had ever tried to disturb it. Wexford Parva did not deny that things had happened. It simply adjusted the space around them, allowing the edges to soften so that they might no longer catch on the sleeves of ordinary life. The boarded window at Proust & Sons remained, though it now appeared purposeful, as though it had always been part of the design. The parcel was collected without ceremony, not opened in public, not discussed in daylight. It was placed somewhere safe and discreet, which in a small town is another way of saying it was placed where it would not be spoken of again. The brass strip vanished from the counter during the slow, distracted hour after lunch, and no one could honestly say when they had last seen it. This was considered a victory for order. Miss Pomfrey, relieved of the duty of witnessing, returned to the careful pouring of tea that nobody required. She found the rhythm of trays comforting and the sound of crockery sincere. Her memory of events flattened gently, like folded linen. She remembered that something had been missing and that something had been mended, which was sufficient to allow her to sleep again without rearranging her thoughts. Mrs. Larkin resumed her visits and her small kindnesses, but now with less insistence. Compliments, she decided, were best used sparingly, like a spice that could so easily spoil the dish. She remembered Leonard not unkindly, not fondly, but correctly, which is to say, at a sensible distance. Her reputation, which had leaned dangerously toward interest, settled back into its accustomed posture of unimpeachable dullness. Leonard Pike did not remain long. There were reasons given and reasons not given. He had, it was said, found an opportunity elsewhere. A clerk's position in another town far enough away to be decent and near enough to be explained. He left quietly, with 2 suitcases and a ledger that was once again full of numbers that meant nothing to anyone but himself. There were no farewells of consequence, no scenes, no public regrets. A chair at the tea room became just another empty place that had once belonged to someone. Purbright returned to his papers, which were as patient as he was. He made a few notes, folded a few corners, and allowed the file to rest among others that had enjoyed brief moments of attention. He did not feel triumph. Triumph was theatrical. He felt instead the mild satisfaction of having prevented noise, and in his profession that was the closest thing to success. The town itself adjusted with care. Conversations returned to subjects of approved safety, the hedges that leaned too far into the footpath, the persistent dampness near the river, the scandalous price of coal. When asked directly about recent events, people responded with expressions suggesting only vague familiarity, as though recalling a dream that one could not swear had been one's own. Mr. Tilden resumed his post office inspections and informed anyone who paused long enough that things seemed to be back to their proper order, which meant that no one was currently attracting too much attention. The council met to discuss gutters and drainage and found themselves unusually united, having learned that unity was the best way to avoid further inquiry. The board that had once hung on the wall was never put back. That, too, was done carefully. It was decided, without ever quite being decided, that the wall looked cleaner without it. There were new plans for a more modern notice, though no one could ever remember who was supposed to draw them up. The space remained pale, and over time became merely a wall again, which was perhaps its greatest mercy. People began, slowly, to forget in the way that small towns forget. Not by erasing, but by rearranging. The broken window was remembered as a simple accident. The parcel became a rumour that lost its shape. Leonard's name faded into the polite category of that quiet fellow who moved away. Mrs. Larkin's compliment diminished into nothing more than a pleasant habit she once had of encouraging the reserved. Purbright walked once more through the square, some weeks later, and observed how carefully the town had folded itself back into its proper lines. He noted the way footsteps had regained their previous patterns, how doors were once again closed with undisguised confidence, how silences had returned to being merely familiar rather than dangerous. He felt no disappointment. Forgetting was not a failure. It was a skill. In Proust and Sons, Miss Pomfrey set a cup upon a saucer at the usual place and for a moment could not remember why she always paused before doing so. The pause passed. The cup settled. Life continued in its approved fashion. There remained, somewhere in the fabric of the town, a faint impression of what had nearly been spoken loudly. It was the kind of impression that surfaces in dreams and is dismissed at breakfast. It was harmless now, and harmlessness was the highest form of achievement to which Wexford Parva aspired. That afternoon, the clock above Hensley's ironmonger's struck 9:20 at precisely the correct moment. The pigeons stirred mildly and then resumed their important business. The town breathed in, breathed out, and slept again in its careful way, holding its secrets not with fear, but with the gentle competence of long practice. Inside his office, Purbright closed the last file with a soft sound and laid his pen straight upon the blotter. Outside, the world returned to being unremarkable, which was, in the end, the kindest conclusion anyone could have hoped for.